Undeniably, the world remains plagued by crisis and a host of enduring injustices owed to colonial power and domination.
In turn, countless revolutionary thinkers from times past and present have identified modernity as a point source of oppression.
When taking stock of the violent ways in which modernity was and continues to be forged, the Caribbean has been ground zero. That is the crucible of modernity.
As an intervention that centers the Caribbean, this season of Surviving Society will provide a window into several of the region's grassroots struggles for land, life, and liberation.
This podcast has been sponsored by Pluto Books.
You can grab 50% off all books by using the code surviving50 at plutobooks.com.
On today's episode, we spoke with Filiberto Penados, Research Director and Professor of Indigenous and Development Studies at Galen University in Belize. Filiberto is also chair of the Julian Cho Society and advisor to the Toledo Alcaldes Association. He has a long history of activist scholarship and movement-relevant research with indigenous communities across Central America and is currently leading several projects on indigenous future making. Okay, good day, everyone. Today we're joined by Filiberto Penados, Yucatec Maya scholar joining us from Belize, who's engaged in a variety of different types of activities, initiatives, ranging from critical development studies to participatory research methods to something that's quite novel, as well as that he'll expand upon more in the conversation, a theme that I've often heard him refer to as indigenous future making. But before we dive into some of the engaged activities, whether it's activism, scholarship, or a combination of both that Filiberto is engaged in, first of all, I'd like to welcome Filiberto to the Crucible of Modernity, as well as the podcast Surviving Society. Filiberto, it's our pleasure to have you here. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, Levi. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to being part of this podcast. I'm looking forward to a conversation with you.
We're going to start out with a question that isn't necessarily easy to answer, but the series, as the title suggests, is focusing on modernity. And so you've been engaged for years now with a variety of different communities on a variety of different initiatives with respect to trying to breathe life into better worlds, for lack of a better way of putting it. This notion of modernity, I'm wondering, as well as in terms of focusing on the Caribbean, what do listeners need to know about modernity, as well as in I think in particular, what has modernity meant for the Caribbean, modernity meant for Central America, what has modernity meant for indigenous people?
Thank you, Levi. So this is a very complicated, difficult question, I think, to ask. So in no way could I possibly answer that in any exhaustive way. But I think there are a few things that are important to know. One is I take a cue from thinkers in Latin America and the Caribbean when I think about modernity. People like Aníbal Quijano, Enrique Dussel, Arturo Escobar, and all of these people, Latin Americans, who actually, when they talk about modernity, they link it to coloniality as two sides of the same coin, that one cannot talk about modernity without talking about coloniality. I think that's important, right? So the other side, so if we tend to think of modernity or modern as being light, often we tend to think of coloniality as being dark, but one is producing the other. So I think it's important to think about those two things at the same time. And so if we think about modernity, then one of the reasons I think we can say that is because modernity, in a sense, emerges as Europe, or what we know as Europe now, comes into contact with precisely the Caribbean region, the Americas. Right, indigenous peoples, and later on, of course, the bringing of people from enslaving people from Africa and bringing it. So, in a sense, the Caribbean, Latin America, has been constitutive of modernity. I like to use the thinking of this thinkers that I had mentioned earlier, because they tend to talk about this coloniality, modernity as a kind of pattern of exercising power, a form of exercising power that, as they say, rests on at least two key elements. One of them being that modernity ultimately is the construction of this hierarchy of difference, especially biological difference, into this hierarchy of race, where certain peoples, certain ways of thinking, certain ways of being, certain ways of knowing are considered to be better, kind of above everything else. And by virtue of that, then the peoples that are encountered during this between Europe and America, indigenous peoples and later on African peoples, they're constituted as being lesser, and so is their knowledge systems, their ways of thinking, their ways of organizing. And that's one of exercising power, because basically you're telling people that is not good, and people kind of also begin to internalize that. And the other one, of course, is that in a sense, it also meant the incorporation of labor. In other words, the work that people do, the resources of indigenous peoples in the Americas, they're inserted into kind of an emerging capitalist system in which no longer these resources, whether it's labor power, whether it is the land, the water, it's no longer serving people in the local spaces, but actually serving somebody else who is extracting value from that. And so if you think about it, then we're talking here about both racism and capitalism as two of the pillars in the exercise of power. They continue to be the case. I think if you look in many places, you will find out that indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant peoples continue to be reporting high indices of poverty versus other subjects in society. So that, I think, is something important to know, that the Caribbean, Latin America was, was the place where that is constituted and continues to affect the Caribbean, of course.
Filiberto, that was an amazing overview, as well as entry point into this discussion of modernity. You've mentioned several things there: hierarchies, exploitation, extraction, race, the advance of capitalism, these sorts of things, as well as then too touched upon the diverse array of different cultures and people even that comprise the Caribbean. You also then sort of mentioned too labor, I think, in sort of flagging the inextricable links between colonial power, the construction and mobilization of race, as well as the driving forces of capital accumulation. I'm wondering what some of the impacts and ongoing aftermaths of modernity has meant in the Caribbean, in the context of Belize that you're working in. What has modernity produced for some of the communities you work with, or more broadly for the Caribbean as a region writ large?
Right. I mean, to begin with, of course, people were displaced. They're dispossessed. They lost land. If I think about the Maya people in Belize, for example, which is a group of people I work with and who I identify as, it meant loss of land, right? Displacement, uprooting. That certainly immediately that there's that, and it meant then that people can no longer sustain themselves. So that had tremendous impact, and you can see the effects of that still. But the interesting thing is that dispossession, uprooting, displacement is not something that only happened at this point of encounter, kind of in a historical past, but actually it's happening as we speak. Okay. And that's why I think it's useful to think about modernity and coloniality as a form of exercising power, that the form of exercising continues to exist as we speak. And maybe later on we'll talk more about this. But if you think about southern Belize, the lands of people, the forests that Maya people depend on, are often sacrificed for the purposes of development to meet the interests of somebody else. So again, this dispossession, this displacing, this uprooting continues to happen. But it also affects kind of the way that people think about themselves, their knowledge systems, right? We tend to assume, for example, that development can only happen through the use of knowledge that is coming from Western science, to put that in quotes, when there are ways of understanding nature, of understanding our relationship with nature that can inform a different vision of the future. So it affects people, it devalues their ways of knowing, and they're displaced. And we continue to see that also operating as we speak. If you look at the curriculum of schools, you don't find indigenous philosophies, for example, there. You don't find indigenous thought there. If it is, it's kind of presented as kind of exotic, something from the past, not really having much to do with the present. And that has tremendous effect, okay? Because the assets that communities have to construct a future are sidelined, are denigrated, are disvalued. So that, I think, is another way. Also, we spoke about labor earlier. In Belize, where I work, during the colonial period, there was an interest in Maya labor, right? Maya labor to produce value, whether it is during the later colonial period, whether it was Maya people going into the forest and tapping for the sap of sapodilla trees to produce the kind of latex that was for chewing gum, right, at very low wages. So there was an interest in exploiting that labor, but that continues to happen. And these things work in hand. I mean, you displace people from their land, you destroy their systems of organizing, you destroy their economy, so they no longer have the capacity for self-reliance. So now they're left then with the only option is to sell their labor, which, as we know, becomes exploitative. So that form of exercising power continues to exist even as we speak.
Okay, yeah, very much taking a critical dissection of the political economy of colonialism and looking at what it produces in the contemporary moment. You mentioned a couple of things there: dispossession, as well as land. And then, having known you, I know that you always tend to circle back to always mentioning communities, as well as into recognizing the political agency of different communities and constituencies in struggle. And the way you put it so poetically, that are trying to construct alternative futures. So I'm wondering, amidst seemingly the violence of modernity that you've just outlined and explained so cogently, what are some of the forms of resistance or political agency, or even construction of futures on the ground that you've been witnessing or participating in or seeing in the Caribbean, and maybe even more specifically in Belize?
Right. It's an excellent question. I like that you raise the question of agency, because it may seem as if when we talk about these things, we might think of indigenous peoples as communities as being victims, that, they need to be saved. The fact is that from the moment of encounter, they have exercised their agency. They have resisted and found ways of maintaining a degree of autonomy in very constrained spaces, but they continue to do so. And in a way, sometimes I think of the fact that indigenous communities continue to speak their language. I work in southern Belize, and you have Kekchi communities that continue to speak the Kekchi language and the Mopan language. And it may sound like something pretty simple, but if you think that enormous pressure that they have received, they have been victims of, to abandon that language, the entire ecology that sustains the language has been destroyed. So they're exercising tremendous agency and resistance to sustain that language and finding ways of continuing it to pass it down to their generation. That's a form of agency. It may seem as something that may not be very important, perhaps, when we think about social movements, but in a way, the fact that they're sustaining the language means that they're sustaining a way of thinking that can be the basis for constructing futures. Certainly. So at the individual level, we have those kinds of acts as well. But collectively, I think you have lots of movements certainly in the Mesoamerican region, in Central America, where people are organizing to protect their rights to land, to defend their lands from encroachment, sometimes by the state, sometimes by transnational companies, by third parties facilitated by the state. They're organizing themselves to do that. You have communities engaged in revitalizing their forms of governance, their knowledge systems, the forms of health. They're doing that, and also imagining how might we go into the future. So in a sense, it's not often we tend to think of indigenous peoples. I tend to go back to indigenous people because that's kind of the people that I work with. but we tend to think that the actions of indigenous peoples are tending towards going to some past, when it is not. It's about carving a space, right? A space for being, right? And here people in Belize talk about living well on the land, for being on the land, right? And being well on the land. So it's carving that space. And carving that space is done in multiple kinds of ways. I said, sustaining the language, sustaining your ways of producing food and eating your own foods, sustaining the ways that you organize, and of course going to court and fighting court cases and being on the streets and protesting and producing ways of thinking, right, that are not only useful to indigenous peoples but beyond. I see those as forms of agency, and I think lots of those things are happening in the region.
One thing you mentioned there that I want to drill down a bit deeper on, Filiberto, is, I mean, you mentioned multinational corporations as well as the role that they're playing, dispossession of land and environmental degradation, but also then the role of the state. And I'm wondering, what is the role of the state in modernity, in development? If you could elaborate upon this entity.
There's tons been written, I'm sure, about theories of the state that I cannot claim to know much about. But I think when I think about it, is that ultimately, the state seems to be both the manager of those lands and resources and labor, ultimately. It ends up being managing that for the purposes of capitalist exploitation, right? So it plays a critical role. On the one hand, I'm thinking about the negative role that it plays, right? Whether it is kind of granting concessions for some company to go into indigenous lands to do that. It tends to facilitate that, right? And of course, the state is underpinned by a way of thinking about development. Development means, kind of moving away from those traditional societies because that's not, their productive systems are not productive. They're not very efficient use of resources. So the state tends to organize all of that, right? And facilitate that process. And we see those kind of things happening in Belize, right? Where that the land rights movement that has been going on for more than 25 years started as a result of a company being granted rights to extract lumber in lands that Maya people consider to be theirs. So the state often facilitates that. We see that also in terms of the free prior and informed consent. Okay, the state is supposed to be vigilant to ensure that indigenous peoples have the space to determine whether this is something that they want or not. Often, states try to do the minimum, right? So it's more about how can we get those indigenous lands, how can we get that indigenous labor available for, these companies that want to make use of that, they're going to be making use of it in a much more productive kind of way. But the state is also kind of shaping identities. I mean, the state is the one that controls education, right? And so the ways that we think about ourselves, when you go to school, you learn to behave in a certain way. There is a national curriculum. That national curriculum it's not pulled out of thin air. It's informed by assumptions, right? And those assumptions that the state is kind of organizing. Those kind of are the negative side. I mean, the state could play an important role and a positive role, right? If it's a much more democratic process and it's more open to the diversity of ideas that exist in the state and ensures that indeed it is managing and protecting the collective resources of the nation state for the benefit of everybody else. I mean, certainly, I think it could be playing that role. Unfortunately, I do not see that they do that or that it does that.
I'm a bit suspicious that the state will ever play a benevolent redistributive role. Having said that, there are ways in which we can sort of, I think, mobilize to put pressure on the state to be less violent in many of the ways that you're talking about. So in talking about modernity, development, the role the state has in facilitating land dispossession, you also mentioned earlier grassroots social movements, the knowledges that are coming from communities, as well as knowledges that aren't necessarily legitimated necessarily as knowledge like we might see in the academy through peer referee or publications in corporate journals. that are putting information and knowledge behind paywalls and making profits off of it. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the knowledge that is emerging from the indigenous Quechua and Mopen Maya communities in Belize, as well as then too, if you could address maybe a bit about something else you mentioned earlier too, their relationships with land. And I think that has connections to also what you were talking about, language revitalization.
Right. I think that we in the last few years have been talking about indigenous revitalization, indigenous resurgence, and I want to approach it from there, and to say it's not so much that indigenous peoples were sleeping, right, and they were not doing anything, because they've constantly resisted, and they're agents, right? I mean, they try to transform their reality and to construct one that's imagined from their own perspectives, from their own grounding. But there is kind of a form of resurgence in some ways, in that, maybe since the 1970s, there's a global indigenous movement. And so indigenous peoples are communicating with each other. And in that sense, you can talk about a resurgence, right? I'm going to speak about that in those terms. So one sees a resurgence where indigenous peoples are engaged perhaps even more actively, more forcefully in trying to reroute themselves, right? Looking back at their own knowledge systems, recognizing that what we have is not working, okay, and that we need alternatives. That has been added to their motivation and inspiration for looking at their knowledge systems, looking at their language to generate knowledge that can inform some kind of alternative. So that what they're doing, as I mentioned earlier, is not so much a going back, but taking what they have, grounding themselves in their own cultural horizon, but imagining new things, because contexts are different, right? And so indigenous peoples continue to do that. And language is a very powerful thing there. I'm fascinated by language, right? I often I remember reading at some point that language is the synthesis of thought, right? And so I need to think about words as being this seeds, okay? The seeds that if you plant, the tree grows, and there's fruit that comes out of it, right? And so language is very powerful. One of the things that I see happening, especially in Toledo, but I think it's beyond that, indigenous peoples are reaching into their language to generate alternative philosophies and alternative to Western philosophies, right? To generate different ways of understanding things. And you can see that, for example, in South America, when indigenous peoples there talk about suma kausai or suma kamania, which has been roughly translated as living well in community, right? As a way of saying, look, I mean, this idea of development, of moving from simple to complex, from, this what is considered tradition to modern, right? To kind of modern society. A village in South America becomes New York. Instead of going that, we've seen what the effects of that are. We need to think differently. Indigenous people have been saying this for a long time, but they're now kind of also generating language to speak about these things that are being picked up by others. So suma kausai, suma kamania, suddenly it makes you think about things differently. And we're seeing the same thing in Belize, okay? There are some concepts that I like to talk about. For example, when I was working down in Toledo in trying to figure out how can we bring people together to engage in dialogue, how do we bring community members to engage in dialogue and imagine what future it is that they would imagine for themselves. We're trying to think, okay, so how do we do this, right? In a way that it is dialogic, in a way that it is it's open to everybody, and we reach into thought that is embodied, for example, in the Popol Vuh, which is the Mayan story of creation, and we reach into a common practice in the community that's called a bink, okay? And a bink means meeting, okay? That's how it's used, but when you think about it, literally it means to listen. So when people say, I'm going to a meeting, they say, Shikwechi Abink, I'm going to listen, okay? So it's a different kind of conception of coming together in a meeting, not so much for, let me speak, okay, but let me listen, right? And so when you start reaching into the language of indigenous peoples, you can generate concepts. There are concepts that can help us to see the world differently. Another one is Aral Choch, which Kekchi people talk about. We are children of the land. And I know you asked about relationship with the land. That concept captures very well Kekchi people's conception of land-human relations. We're children of the land. That's what it says. Okay, but when it is examined, it means, I come from the land, I depend on the land, I use the land, I care for the land. Okay, and you can see that embodied in the relationship that indigenous peoples have with the land. Okay, and right now it's become center stage where my people in Toledo are saying, okay, what does the church mean for us, and what will that mean in the future? So those are the kinds of things that I see happening, and gets me excited because it provides a breath of fresh air, new ideas that we so much need given the challenges that we face.
No, that was incredibly eloquently put, as well as inspiring on a host of fronts, especially when you start to talk about different Maya conceptions of the world, the ways in which when people come together, they prioritize listening, maybe rather than grabbing the spotlight or being the one that's heard and seen. A very humble and I think also collective approach to what it means to be a member of a community. Filiberto, you're talking about land as well as defending territory, revitalizing languages. I'm familiar with your work. I've read a lot of it throughout the years. Some of the major projects that you've been engaged in and things we've discussed even previously. In talking about modernity, as well as into the ways in which development and nationalism is mobilized, but then too, in a very grounded grassroots sense, some of the organizing that's being done amongst the Maya communities. And you mentioned imagination earlier, and I know one of the major projects that you were engaged in, if not even co-lead of or facilitating, was called The Future We Dream. And so in taking stock of what modernity has produced for indigenous communities and Maya communities in particular in Belize, I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about this project, as well as even to the spirit of the future we dream, what that produced, what that involved, and what that might mean for advancements for the Maya people in Toledo district.
Thank you for asking about that. It is work that I'm very proud of being a part of. I think when we ended up writing that, we spoke about weaving. We spoke about I was a weaver along with many other weavers, right? And I think that was a very beautiful way of thinking about what went into doing that. Often people think about indigenous peoples as being people of the past, maybe struggling in the present, and who knows whether they make it into the future as indigenous peoples. So we tend to think of indigenous peoples as peoples of the past, as victims kind of thing. Far from that. We spoke about how indigenous peoples are agents, right? They're social and political actors. Every day they wake up and they are creating a world. So the Maya people in southern Belize had been consumed since the middle 90s with defending their rights to land, defending their lands from encroachment and going to court and trying to ensure that the state protects those rights. And in 2015, they obtained a court ruling that affirmed their rights to land. Now, we know that court rulings still have to be implemented, and the states are never willingly give up access to resources, which is ultimately what it is that they're interested in. And so the struggle continues. However, it meant that it was a win, no doubt, for indigenous peoples in Toledo. And it served then as a moment for thinking, well, maybe we need to reflect a little bit to ensure that we remain on the path that we want to be. Let's see why it is that we started this. And one of the things that leaders kept repeating is like, we never went to the court to want to tell us that these lands are ours. We know it's ours. And two, we never went to get land just as real estate, as something that we can sell. What would be the point of that? But we really went to struggle for land as a place to be. Okay, as a place to be and to be well. And so that's one. And the other thing was saying, well, okay, we're struggling, and there have been generations that have been engaged in the struggle. How do we ensure that this struggle is going to have continuity? What do the young people think, okay, about where we're going? So in a sense, inevitably one begins to talk about the future, okay, what it is that we're going to do with our lands. Not that people are not doing something with their lands, but it became a moment for engaging collectively in a process of reflection. And so it was felt that, we need to bring a cross-section of the community to talk about this sort of issues, right? To figure out what's the way forward. And in doing that, I mean, the leaders are very aware that they didn't want to talk about what's our development project, because immediately you start thinking about development and you're kind of trapped into a certain way of thinking. And so from that emerged the idea that what we really need to do is to imagine and to dream our future. So that's how we ended up calling it the future we dream, because it is the future that Maya people dream. And to create a space where that dream wasn't being dreamed only within modernity, so to speak, okay, but recognizes the power of modernity always, that way for exercising power is always present. We looked at ways of doing that. And so in that process, what we did was to formulate 3 questions that we wanted our communities to engage in. One of them is like to take account of who it is that we are. Because in a sense, that's kind of the rooting oneself. Who am I? It means that you take account of your knowledge, it takes account of your assets, it takes account also of your pains, of course. But who are we? Okay, that was one. The second question is, where are we? And that more specifically looked at where does it hurt? Okay, what are the pains that we're feeling? And also, what are our joys? What are those assets that we have as a community? And the third question was, okay, and where do we envision ourselves? So we did that, and we used concepts, as I said, the idea of a bink, which is we're coming here to listen to each other. And we drew on the Popol Vuh, for example, where in there it talks about the creation of the world emerges out of dialogue. The gods come together, and there's silence, and they join their words and thought. And it's through that process that human beings are created. So the very creative process in Maya cosmology involves this dialogue of coming together. So that's kind of what we tried to use. And we posed these 3 questions. We had people do drawings of what they thought about. And ultimately, to put it in a nutshell, people were saying, well, we're people, we're La Church, we're people of the land. We have tremendous resources. We're people who have knowledge, we have our own way of knowing and being in the world. We're not what many people think we are. And there are lots of pains, there are threats that we face. But what we dream is a future in which, we have a community and harmonious relationships, so to speak, with the land. And we are incorporating, of course, knowledge from other horizons as we build this kind of future where it's going to be, we're going to be well, and we're going to be well together. In a nutshell, I think it's kind of what the essence of that dream was. Pictures, of course, tell it much better than I do with words.
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, we should all be reading picture books rather than dense academic articles with text only. Creative expression is where it's at. Filiberto, I'm wondering too, in talking about this project, or maybe even more so accurately, process of the future we dream, it seems like it's self-determination in practice to some degree. The Maya communities coming together, and what I'm getting at there, that wasn't necessarily something that was a development project that was put together and facilitated by multilateral institutions like the UN or the World Bank, or even maybe well-intentioned NGOs, but it seems like this was something that was very grassroots and oriented in community desires, as well as then too wanting to breathe life into better futures. And I'm wondering with the future we dream, maybe you could elaborate upon some of those things I just mentioned, but also then too, it seems like it highlighted some of the diversity amongst the communities, in that it seems like you were engaging with a variety of different Maya people, recognizing, of course, Maya communities, as well as indigenous communities, as well as the Caribbean, is not a monolith, and that there's a lot of heterogeneity across communities that might identify as Maya. So I'm wondering, what were some of the differential joys, pains, and dreams of the different constituencies or groups that you engaged with as part of The Future We Dream?
Sure. A couple of things I think that you highlighted and are very important to continue to highlight. One of them is that it's process. So The Future We Dream, it was the start of a collective dreaming process, right? And collective dreaming is happening in communities and all the time, right? But this is a format, but it's a process and the initiation of a path. It's not a plan, like it's not a blueprint, right? It's not a blueprint that says, year one, we're going to do this, year two, we're going to do that. But this is it's an inspiring dream that has to be owned ultimately by the diverse actors and diverse societies, if you want, within indigenous society itself. So if you think about in Toledo, where we're talking about 29 different communities, there's a dream kind of at this level that individual communities, pick up and shape it in their own sort of way. So it's not a final thing, that's for sure. Okay, it's for sure. It involved women, it involved men, it involved young people, both female and male. It involved elders, it involved leaders, and it involved dissenting voices, right? Also, and that was kind of interesting, because often, as the discussions, the conversations would carry on, you would have different viewpoints. But one thing that people always agreed on is this idea of, we are indigenous peoples, right? We are people of the land. And this idea that we want to sustain our community and sustain our land. That was like often common. Maybe the mechanisms of how we might do that might be different, but at essence, that was something that people agreed upon. You're talking to women, you're talking to young people, different sectors of Mayan society have different concerns. So, for example, young people, access to education is something definitely very important. At the same time, that access, as they spoke about education, there others would also bear on this question and be talking about it's not just education, but it's an education that responds to the aspirations that we have as Maya people. Women, interestingly, women, spoke about healthy environment. That was something that they were very concerned about, and spaces for children. They're concerned very much about their children. And this, in kind of in parentheses, that among the Zapatistas, women have played a tremendous role. And in a sense, I've seen some treatises being written about the fact that often is as women witnessed the violence against their children that triggered some of this action. Okay, and so women are very powerful in providing and giving shape to this dream. So absolutely, it is not a monolithic society, and the process aimed to not kind of provide an absolute answer to this, right? But to generate dialogue and to open the spaces for continued conversation. So that in the last couple of years, even after the Future We Dream exercise, you and I have been collaborating, creating spaces for young people where we continue to explore with them not only the future that we dream, but also the threats that they face, right? As a way of continuing to generate spaces for dreaming and for action.
Okay, that perfectly dovetails with my next question, Filiberto, because you had mentioned threats before as well as challenges, and you just mentioned it there when you wrapped up your question. So the opposite side of the coin with respect to breathing life into self-determination, as well as maybe constructing autonomy, whilst you are simultaneously dreaming pluralistic dreams and trying to make them come true amongst the Maya communities in Toledo district. I'm wondering about those threats. So what are some of the threats the Maya communities face?
No, we can talk about some concrete threats, and then maybe we can talk about the ultimate threat. So, so
very succinct way to put it.
I mean, the threats, of course, there are third parties that are interested in the resources of Maya people, right? I mean, and they continue to come and try to coerce, right, Maya people into ceding land resources and thereby facilitating the state. That is a big threat, and the communities recognize that. That is a threat to the environment, but it's also a threat to community, because there's no doubt that the community, there is division within the community, the different perspectives. There's no doubt that these communities are marginalized and are poor in quotes. And so there are material needs, and often, an oil company comes and says, we're going to drill for oil, we're going to create jobs. It can create division within the community, right? So there's a threat also in that sense. There are threats, that the participants in this process, for example, identified loss and erosion of knowledge, because you have an education system that does not value it and does not encourage it. So that's also poses a threat. These assets on which the Maya people are dreaming an alternative future are under threat. Okay, so there's that as well. There are threats also even from good things as biodiversity conservation, right? We want to protect the natural environment, as a form of mitigating and addressing the challenges of climate change. But sometimes it means that we're going to create a park and we're going to remove indigenous peoples from there. So with not necessarily often, let me be careful there, but there are times when the conservation goals take priority over the priority of indigenous peoples. And so even those can be a threat to indigenous peoples. Climate change certainly is a big threat, right? Indigenous peoples are the ones who contribute the least, but stand to, suffer the most among those who would suffer the most as a result of climate change. They do rain-fed agriculture. So that's a big threat, okay, as well. But I think ultimately, and if you think
alert.
Ultimately, what is causing this thing? What is it that is leading to this, climate degradation, this environmental degradation or inequality? We are talking about an economic system, right? We are talking about capitalism here. And so that must be confronted, right? And we're talking about racist capitalist kind of system. So I think in some, that's kind of the ultimate at the bottom of it, and it must be confronted. Now, Maya people cannot confront it on their own, right?
This is true. Yeah.
That they're engaged in trying to make do, right? And imagine alternatives, and they're engaging, of course, with other actors elsewhere. But it's a struggle ultimately that it's not only Maya peoples, it's your struggle, my struggle, in Liverpool, here in Billy City, and in other places as well.
Indeed. No, that's I think as accurate of a diagnosis of modernity as we're going to get. Filiberto, you've rightly circled back and mentioned several times education, and much in the spirit of Frantz Fanon, who said political education is a historical necessity amongst the masses. I'm wondering what role education has if we are thinking about emancipatory futures, if we are thinking about liberation, and if we are thinking about ultimately freedom, as well as then you said a place to be well. And that's seemingly a very simple thing to do, but a lot of people in the world, be they indigenous or non-indigenous, aren't provided with circumstances and conditions in which they get to live well. And so I'm wondering, what is the role of education, as well as then too, maybe you can even talk a little bit about solidarity you mentioned there in terms of Maya people can't take down capitalism on their own. We need more solidarity. So the role of education in speaking back or undermining or even confronting modernity. What are your thoughts on education?
Right. it is a double-edged sword, isn't it? I mean, I think education could play a major role, and I emphasize the could.
It sounds like there's an important caveat coming.
That's right. My background is I started in the field of education, and I engage in efforts to transform education. It's not an easy process, right? I mean, there are many people who have tried, and I think we continue to lament the fact that education tends to be more about fitting people as little cogs in this productive system. And that kind of education will certainly not result in any kind of transformative process. So it can play a major role if it begins to challenge young people to think critically about their experiences. And here I think we can draw a page from Paulo Freire, right? I mean, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is how do we get young people to read the world, okay, and to transform the world. But I sense often that education doesn't tend to focus on that. It's always about how do we make our children much more competitive in the market. Sweden is doing this with their children, we should be catching up with them. So less than analyzing what is going on, interpreting kind of reality. So it can play a major role, but I think there's a lot of needs to be done in terms of, I guess I'm talking here about formal education, like schooling, right? Yeah. But there are other forms of education, and I see lots of that happening in indigenous spaces and in other places. The leaders in Maya leaders in Toledo, the indigenous leaders there, often talk about we need to bring the young people and have them just accompany the process, attend meetings, right, where they're developing an awareness, and that has tremendous power. Okay. Or the spaces where we're bringing young people to, through creative ways to talk about where it hurts, the threats that they face, the concerns that they have, and the futures that they dream. It forces them to take account of that reality and to think about that, and opens possibilities, creates a space for them to dream. I think education can play a major role in terms of that, and we need to create more and more of those spaces. Yes, learning the mathematics and the computer science is important, no doubt, right? But there's this other side, I think, that is neglected by the education system, that we must struggle to create. In terms of solidarity, imperative, right? It is imperative that we build more and more solidarity, whether it is within Belize. Okay, so Maya people are engaged in a struggle in southern Belize, but their struggle is not different than Afro-descendants in Belize City. Or recently, for example, an Afro-descendant community in the coast of Belize, Gales Point Manatee, who is now under threat because some international company wants to basically level mountains to exploit the rocks there to be exported to North America for building roads. The struggle is not different, right? Whether it's workers, that are struggling for better wages and better working conditions, their struggle is not different in many ways than the Maya people in Toledo. They're struggling against similar set of things, which is, racist, racial capitalism, if you want, right, or modernity, right? And so solidarity needs to be built there and beyond. I think if you talk to Maya leaders in Toledo, they'll tell you that one of the things that's allowed them to achieve what they have achieved is solidarity. They're present in conversations that's happening globally with other indigenous peoples from South America, from Asia, from North America, from not only other indigenous peoples, but accomplices or allies, right? Who in other spaces who also recognize the challenges and threats that we face as humanity and want to engage in solidarity. So solidarity is definitely important.
Okay, two very potent elixirs: political education and international solidarity, or maybe intergeographical or translocal solidarity that you're mentioning there. I want to go back to one of the threats you mentioned, as well as then too sort of some of the struggles to protect the environment or defend land that Maya communities are making. as well as then too something that's making the news all around the world that also has prompted quite a bit of action from even youth all over the world. But this threat of climate change, as well as then to the degree to which it's impacting different indigenous and Afro-descendant and peasant communities, but then also thinking about climate change and in this cliche term as a global challenge. What are some of the solutions or contributions that indigenous communities are making to this global challenge, and what are some of the interventions that they're engaged in from your vantage point?
Right. It's an excellent question. It's increasingly being recognized that indigenous peoples are leaders in climate action. I think that's the phrase that is used by UN agencies, and that's absolutely true. Not the only leaders, sure, but they are leaders in climate action. You know, if I go back to the concept of Ral Church, which is we're children of the land, recognizing that we depend on the land. It's so close, right? I mean, this has concrete meaning. I go and I cultivate the land, I go hunting, I collect medicine, I collect materials for building my house. The idea that I depend on the land and I belong to the land is not an abstract idea. I live it every day, and that's true for indigenous peoples. They are trying to imagine how to sustain that, and using tools that are drawing from other cultural horizons. So, in thinking of how we do land use planning, they're making use of those kinds of concepts from their own cultures to kind of think about how they're going to manage those resources. Definitely their knowledge of agriculture systems, agroecology, right? Today, there's a lot of interest in agroecology. It's nothing new. I mean, it seems as if it's something new, the way that we think about it, but agroecological practices have always been present in indigenous communities. If, I live in a small community, and I can recall my grandmother and her backyard and what a beautiful garden, rich with food that was. And so indigenous peoples, have much to contribute in terms of that. Their contribution is linked to ensuring that there is a space for indigenous ways of knowing and being. It's not about taking a piece of knowledge that indigenous peoples have and then applying it elsewhere. It's not about that. That's not the contribution. I think the only contribution that indigenous peoples can make. But it is connected, for example, to recognizing the rights that indigenous peoples have to land. And maybe ultimately, it may not be that the technologies that are drawn only from indigenous peoples, but there's a way of thinking and there's inspiration that can be drawn, I think, from the work that indigenous peoples are doing.
Okay. Yeah, it makes complete sense. You had mentioned there the ways in which particular pieces of knowledge might be extracted, as well as then even maybe grafted or taken. And that made me start thinking about research. And a lot of listeners to this podcast will be academics and researchers. And there is no shortage, especially when it comes to indigenous communities, of extraction as well as then imposition that end up emerging in quote unquote research collaborations or research partnerships, these sorts of things. And so I'm wondering when we think about academic research projects, as fraught politically as they can be, as extractive as they can be, are there any ethical ways of going about conducting research with or alongside indigenous communities, as impossible of a question that may be to answer? But I'm wondering what your thoughts are on in terms of knowledge production, as well as then to dialogues across these different ontologies or knowledges. What does ethical engagement look like with indigenous communities in terms of sort of collaboration?
Right. It's a very big topic there.
We're going to need another hour.
Another hour, and I need to think about that. But certainly, I think that Linda Smith, I think in her book talked about how research for indigenous peoples is a dirty word. right? Because
decolonizing methodologies, yeah.
Yes, decolonizing methodologies. Research is she had a line there, said for indigenous peoples, research is has been, or is a dirty word. I don't remember the exact words, but research has been often extractive, right?
Yeah.
And often, many times, would construct indigenous peoples in a particular way, and sometimes that knowledge that is produced, then used against indigenous peoples. So obviously those are things that we have to avoid. I think allyship, accomplishship, I don't know how to say being an accomplice, being an ally.
I like it.
Co-production of knowledge. Often, if you think about it, often as researchers, we're interested in answering questions that are of interest to us, that serve our purposes. It's not very often that we're actually engaging in research questions that respond to the needs, aspirations, interests of those who are researching. Certainly that is necessary. Maybe we need to start putting our research capacities at the service of indigenous communities in struggle.
Okay.
I think it's definitely very important. One thing I know is that in order to be an ally, in order to be an accomplice, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of humility. It's not something that you're going to come and do. All right, I'm going to go and do research in Colombia, and this is going to be, I'm going to be an ally of this indigenous community. I'll be there for 3 weeks. That's not going to happen. It takes a long time to cultivate that. It's developing relationships, and indigenous peoples are open, I think, to others, and because they recognize that they have something to say, and certainly others also have something to learn as well. I think it's something that I've learned from indigenous peoples. But to go back to this question of is there what might be some ethical ways of doing it? I think I've shared in the past this story, maybe with you, Levi, that one of the things I learned when I had the opportunity to spend some time in New Zealand was this story about how meetings occur between two tribes, so to speak, of Maori people. And Maori people in New Zealand, they have a marae, which is the ancestral house, a house where the community meets, and often they would host, and another tribe would come and discuss an issue with them. And it was interesting, and I was able to experience this process. It was interesting to see the process through which they arrived at consensus, where they moved from being two strangers, so to speak, getting to know each other, and then kind of engaging in dialogue and arriving at some consensus. When the visiting group would arrive at the compound of this host community, they would stand out and they would chant, right? They would chant, "We are, these people, we arrived in New Zealand in this canoe, this is who we are." And in a way, then the host would acknowledge who they are and tell their own story. Okay. And so there would be a mutual acknowledgement of each other and each other's dignity. And they would gradually move closer. They would be invited to come in. Okay. And again, they would go through the process. It would move forward, where one of the warriors from one tribe would walk to the center of the midpoint between the host and the guests and place a gift, a koha. And the host would then decide to pick it up or not. But if they decided to pick it up, they would walk forward, pick it up, and they say that whatever is now going to be discussed no longer belongs to the host or the guest, but belongs to the whole. And they then move to sharing the breath of life, pressing your forehead with each other. And so I know it's a kind of a long story, but my point is that if you want to do research that is respectful, right, then you have to be open to the interests and aspirations of the indigenous communities. There's time that's involved, right, to build this relationship, and it requires mutual respect for the dignity of each other. I know that not meant offer some concrete, practical steps, but I think it does offer kind of an ethos that one can use to underpin one's engagement with Indigenous peoples.
It's perfect. It's a beautiful story, as well as significant aspect of revolutionary possibilities being what lies at the heart of those. I think is mutuality, and is if I'm listening correctly to what you're saying, these sorts of things. Filiberto, this has been incredibly enlightening. We've got a few minutes left. I've got a couple more questions, and then we're going to go into a bit of a lightning round. But before we go into the lightning round questions, where we give listeners some content to engage with after they're done listening to this episode, two of my favorite questions. But if you take stock of the future that different communities are dreaming, as well as then too, if you sort of begin to assess the threats we face collectively in different ways, of course, around the world, I'm wondering, question number one, what gives you hope with respect to the existential threat of climate change that we face, the destructive advance of capital, and what it's producing for communities as well as the environment? So one, what gives you hope? And then two, what does justice demand? So what gives you hope? And then what would a just world look like from your vantage point?
Immediately, what comes to me is young people. They give me tremendous hope. We tend to think that things are going wrong, and sometimes we think, oh, Indigenous peoples are not interested and concerned. That's certainly not the case, and we have seen that in this struggle against climate change, right? The threats of climate change. I see it also in Toledo. I see younger leaders coming up, and sometimes we think, oh, what's going to happen when that leader kind of departs? Who's going to take over? And when that leader departs, somebody is there to take up the place. So I don't, that gives me tremendous hope. I don't think that it is all lost. In terms of what does justice demand? Man, it demands diligent work and honesty, I think. I don't think one can sleep, and one cannot give up. I see my colleagues who are engaged in work, for justice. It requires a lot of work and persistence, even in the face when things seem to look dire. They continue to struggle, and that kind of work has produced its fruits, certainly in Toledo, which is where I often work. Yeah.
Okay. No, I think all of those things make complete sense given the realities that we're all trying to navigate in seemingly a world that is defined by omnicrisis in a variety of different ways. So on that point too, of also looking to the Youth for Hope, as well as sort of ending on a positive note, we've got a bit of rapid fire questions that we're going to go through in a little segment we call Radical Knowledge Beyond the Podcast. And Filiberto, I'm just going to fire at you a series of 5 or 6 questions. But question number 1, what is one of your favorite quotes? Who is it from? And why do you like this quote?
There's a quote that I've been using, and I don't know who it comes from. And the quote goes something like, reality is a lot more than we can say about it.
Very deep.
And I find that, tremendously humbling, but also empowering. Okay. It means it calls me to listen to others, and it also tells me that I have something to say.
Question number 2. What social movement should listeners become familiar with, and why?
Well, this one, I think that I've drawn a lot of inspiration from. And of course, that's the struggle of Maya people in southern Mexico, the Zapatistas. And I think that they struggle, and they struggle with joy, and they're inspiring in that sense. And they produce, ways of thinking that I would never dream of. I'm constantly learning from them.
Okay, I'm with you on that. And speaking of also the significant role that grassroots Indigenous women play, long live Comandante Ramona, as well as the EZLN. So that's, I think, a very apt social movement. Question number 3, what book is a must read and why?
I think one of the most inspiring books I've read in my academic career was Pedagogy of the Oppressed.
Yeah. Okay.
It provided me with a language to understand what I was living. So definitely, I think I would recommend it to everybody.
Right. Reading realities, reading the world. You mentioned those early in the podcast,
right.
as well as into the way that we're sort of assessing things and engaging in praxis. Makes complete sense with everything that you've mentioned today. What film is a must-see and why?
Oh my, this is a tough one. Again, along the same lines, I remember watching, it's an old documentary. It's called Ancient Futures, Learning from Ladakh.
Okay, this is new to me. Go on, tell me more.
Ancient Futures, Learning from Ladakh actually is a documentary about a community in India that struggles with the challenges of development. And it communicates the challenge of modernity and development in a very powerful way.
Okay, very much relevant to the theme of this episode, as well as into building a bit of international awareness and solidarity across different geographies that have been impacted by empire. So what was the name of that film again, one more time?
Ancient Futures, Learning from Ladakh.
Okay, cool. I'll have to check that out, even if the listeners don't. Number 5, I think we're going to be spoiled for choices when you answer this. What song or musician is a must listen and why?
Okay, well, I listen mostly to Spanish music.
That's fine.
So Mercedes Sosa, Argentinian singer, a beautiful voice, inspiring lyrics. It is music of the revolution in a sense.
Yeah.
Yes, and it speaks, I think, from the heart and tells stories about, communities, and beautiful. It's inspiring.
Final question here. What artist, poet, thinker, any type of person engaged in creative expression should listeners become familiar with, and why?
Okay, here I'm going to. I thought one of the thinkers I've been following is Enrique Dussel. That's kind of more of on the academic side, but in terms of poetry, and I think it's important, is Humberto Acabal.
Mm-hmm.
He is a Maya poet, Humberto Acabal. Beautiful poetry, communicates the reality of communities in a very powerful and simple way. He says, the moon is a tortilla and the sky is a comal. Right? If you've been to Maya community, and that imagery is just powerful. I just love that.
Yeah, it captures it in a lot of different ways, in also very human ways. That's a very fitting as well as uplifting way to end. Filiberto, I want to thank you for your time. Listeners, be sure to check out content that Filiberto just mentioned, but we'll also link to some of Filiberto's writing, as well as some of the initiatives he's been engaged in the show notes below.
Thank you for listening to Surviving Society.
To support our work, you can rate,
review and subscribe. To host or produce a series of Surviving Society,
get in touch with us via Twitter or Instagram.